Okay. All right. We are live on Zoom and live on YouTube. And so I think it's now good. We're good to begin. So welcome everyone to, oh, all right. We are live on Zoom and live on YouTube. And so I think it's now good. We're good to begin. All right. So welcome everyone to, oh, all right. Okay, I have multiple YouTube screens open. Now we should be good. Okay. So welcome everyone to the second annual Santa Cruz Mountains Bioregional Council Big Basin meeting. Let me, so we are, sorry, I'm getting a phone call also. So we are pleased to, that everyone's here. Thank you all for showing up. And I'm going to start by introducing the Santa Cruz Mountains Bioregional Council President, which is Jen Michelsen. Jen, hopefully you should be able to unmute yourself here. And she will explain briefly about how tonight's going to go. So tonight will be a set of 5 speakers. They have allotted 20-minute time slots. They have 15 minutes to give a talk and 5 minutes for questions. We thank them so much for spending the time out of their busy schedules to do this. If you want to see a list of the speaker talks, you can go to our website at SCMBC.org, and there's a list of the speakers and the talks there. We will have time for questions, so please write your questions in the chat, either on Zoom or on YouTube, and we can monitor those questions. Try and do so earlier rather than later. We can't get to every question, but we will try and get to as many as we can. So with that, I'll give it to Jen to take it away. So Jen, if you will, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Zane.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Jen Michelsen. As Zane said, I'm the president of the Santa Cruz Mountains Bioregional Council, and I'd like to welcome you all to the second annual symposium on the research and recovery of the CZU lightning complex fire that burned through Big Basin State Park on August 18th, 2020. That fire was unprecedented, being the most severe fire to strike the park in all of recorded history. 2 important causes of the fire were the buildup of forest fuels and a climate that's hotter and drier. State Parks has pledged to address the forest fuels problem through a prescribed fire program. However, significant challenges are with the fire in the state parks, and would limit the amount of prescribed fire that can occur. Unfortunately, the role played by climate change is even more difficult to fix. According to scientists at NASA, the average temperature of the Earth is warmer now than it has been in the last 125,000 years. A recent tree ring study has shown that human-caused climate change has contributed substantially to a mega drought that lasted from 2000 to 2021. It's been the driest 22-year period in the last 1,200 years. Overall, climate change has made our forests more flammable. The CZU lightning fire is just a taste of what's to come unless we, as a global society, make sweeping changes to reduce our use of greenhouse gases. The forest in the burn area won't fully recover in our lifetimes, but the landscape affected by the CZU fire needs to be actively managed in a way that supports the recovery of biodiversity by using the latest scientific findings to aid in those efforts. And that's why we're sponsoring this symposium tonight. We would like to thank all of our presenters for their efforts to monitor in the burn area and for presenting their latest findings for us. And now I'll turn it back over to Zane Moore to begin the program. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jen. We will start off with our first speaker. We have Jerry Smith. He's a professor emeritus from San Jose State University, who will be talking to us about the streams, specifically Waddell Creek in the burn area on the western and southwestern side of Big Basin. Jerry, you should be able to unmute yourself now, and I will share your slideshow.
Okay, I'm unmuted now.
Great, and your slides are up, Jerry. So the way this will work is Jerry will give a 15-minute talk, and again, we'll have 5 minutes for questions. So as they come up, please enter your questions in the chat on Zoom or on YouTube. Thank you.
In 1992, I started sampling Waddell Creek annually up until this year for steelhead and coho salmon, and have also been studying the frogs out in the lower part of the stream since 1998. And every year it's, should I continue doing studies? And I was ready to give it up in 2020, and then the fire hit, and so that means 3 more years of study. Next slide, please. Okay, this is an aerial photo, Google Earth, from right after the fire was out, mostly out in 2020. And off to the upper right is the main headquarters area, Big Basin, and it's relatively flat topography. And Rancho del Oso section of Big Basin is to the west. And if you take a look, it's a wrinkly area. These are very steep slopes, completely different in terms of the vegetation there. This is second and third growth forest. It's been logged for redwoods. There's a lot of Douglas fir present. And so it's a completely different situation. So when people talk about, well, most of the redwoods in Big Basin survived, the forest in the western part here in Rancho del Oso didn't fare as well. Next slide, please. This is a photo of Waddell Creek, the section I work with, excuse me, right after the fire. And you can see Stevens Camp down at the bottom, which is about 2.5, 2.6 miles up from the coast. There's green forest around. The fire didn't really burn to the stream. And then as you go up the slide, upstream on Waddell Creek and into the West Fork, you can see that the green basically disappears, so that by the forks, the fire burned across the stream and had very heavy damage. And then if you look at the slopes on the west side here of Waddell and West Waddell Creek, it's very steep, very dry, and most of the area is Santa Cruz mudstone, the chalks area. And the East Fork of Waddell Creek, as you go upstream there, it's Butano sandstone, and that has really different characteristics in terms of what goes on in the channel. And so I've gone back since the fire and looked at what's happened to the channel and the stream side and have sampled the fish populations. Next slide, please. Now this is in June 2022, and here you see a fair amount of green, especially over in the old Big Basin area. But if you look at the left side of the screen along Waddell Creek, there's an awful lot of bare ground. Now the green doesn't mean it's forest. It means by June you had a lot of ground cover, especially blue blossom Ceanothus, but there's substantial bare ground still on the areas along Upper Waddell Creek. Next slide, please. Now we've been through 3 winters, but those winters are nothing like each other. The first winter was very dry, still basically kind of continuing the drought conditions. And so you burned up the ground cover with a fire, and there was basically on the slopes, there was no new ground cover at the time of the winter time, but it was a mild winter, so not too much happened throughout most of the watershed. Now, in October and December of 21, you had storms. They fell on areas without any new ground cover. And the ground cover really didn't develop until middle of summer in 2022. So there were some major floods during October and December, and without the ground cover there, we got widespread erosion and stream deposition in 2022. And then we'll come back to it later. This last winter was the deluge. Still no ground cover on parts of the Waddell Creek watershed, and we had just major storms, widespread erosion and stream deposition. All kinds of things happened. Next slide, please. Okay, this is another aerial photo, and this is from June 22. The first real winter, 2021, after the fire, there was one major debris flow that came down to the forks, and it was from the top of the slopes all the way down. And that had some major sedimentation effects, basically on the main stem of Waddell Creek, down about 1/3 of a mile. It's filled a lot of the pools. Next slide, please. Now in 2022, we had a much wetter winter, and basically up the west fork of Waddell, upstream of the forks, there were major debris flows and sheet erosion down to the stream. Again, there still wasn't any ground cover in place that second winter, and there's not very much in place after the third winter. And so there's major changes each year in terms of how much sediment went into the stream and what the effects were. And then there's major differences up and downstream. Next slide, please. In 2021, upstream to mile 2.75, the fire burned to the stream very sparsely. Mostly it burned to the riparian zone, And so there was limited effect on the stream in the first summer downstream of mile 275, although there were places where the fire burned to the edge and actually cooked the alders, which provide a lot of the shade in the system, and killed the alders. In 2022, still not much change along the stream, but you have all the effects from upstream with the major storms filling the pools with sediment from upstream. And there was some west slope erosion in certain areas. And then there was large movement of wood. You had enough of a storm that second winter that you moved a lot of large wood, and you produced a number of log jams. And you actually started filling up some of the areas downstream of mile 2.75, filled up the pools. Next slide, please. From mile 2.8 up to the confluence of the east and west forks, that one debris flow that was rim to river in the upper right, that filled most of the pools down to mile 2.8. And so if you would look down the stream, you'd see, wow, that used to be a pool that was 2 feet deep or 3 feet deep or 4 feet deep, but instead, like the low left picture, it was filled with gravel from this Santa Cruz mudstone. Now in this area, the fire burned to and across the stream. The alders were mostly killed up to the forks. And a lot of them were in the stream in 2021 and 2022. In the lower right picture, there was one major log jam that grew in 2022 to gather up most of these dead alders. In 2023, that log jam broke and reformed downstream. So this is what it looks like in 2022 up to the forks. Next slide, please. The difference between the west and the east fork, or slopes on these streams, is a difference in how steep they are, how wet they are. And so on the west slope, from miles 2.8 up to 3.7, very steep slopes, more erosion, especially upstream of the forks. Most of the forest upslope was killed, and not much ground cover. On the east slope along the stream, all the way up the system, there was substantial ground cover developed by 2022 and even substantial cover in 2021. Next slide, please. Upstream on the west fork up to mile 3.7, where I stopped sampling, in 2021, you lost most of the canopy from the surviving trees, but the fire burned basically across the stream, killed all the alders, eliminated much of the canopy even on redwoods, and burned a lot of the channel wood. So when people say, you get some wood in the stream from the fires, the fire burned most of the channel wood on the west fork. And then there was, in 2021, some localized west slope erosion. But in 2022, the lower pictures, the bare hills just let loose. And so the channel, if you look at the bottom middle picture, that was a pool that was almost 200 feet long and more than 3 feet deep. It was completely filled. In the lower right was a pool that was even deeper upstream. We were never able to actually sample it for fish, and it completely filled in 2022. And there was no recovery in 2023. Next slide, please. And this is the reason why. In 2023, from December through March, there were major storms, and the bare hills on the west slope on West Waddell Creek just gave more sediment downstream. So you filled everything that wasn't already filled on the west fork of Waddell Creek, and you filled all the way to the mouth of Waddell Creek most of the pools. And then the storm was big enough that bank trees were toppled, and the channel wood was aggregated into jams. Next slide, please. So this is what it looks like in 2023. On the West Fork, the upper left picture is a typical picture of the slope. Dead trees and bare ground until you get right down to the stream itself. The ground cover that was developed in much of the rest of the watershed has not developed on the west slope of the West Fork. The wood that, excuse me, the wood that went into the stream, normally you think, wow, if we get some wood in the stream, that's very good. But what actually happened was with the big storm, you moved most of the wood and aggregated it into gigantic log jams. In the lower left, you see where the wood from mile 2.75 and upstream all gathered down at mile 2.65 to 7. You've got a log jam that's as big as a football stadium, or not a stadium, but as big as a football field. So the floods moved most of the wood into a few areas. And so this is not providing structure in most of the stream for the development of pools. It's all in one big pile, which can be a barrier to fish movement, and this one probably is. The channels in the stream, and this is all the way down to the mouth of the stream, are basically filled with sediment. The upper middle picture there, that's what used to be a deep pool at Twin Redwoods Camp, deep enough that it was a swimming pool, and it's basically filled except for some local scour around that bit of wood up there. Another pool at that same site is completely filled with sediment, and that's to the right there. And then the floods also knocked down streamside alders and took an awful lot of wood and put it out in the floodplain where it doesn't help for pool development in the stream. The lower right picture is the pool just upstream of the lagoon, and that pool is filled, and the wood that could be doing something in terms of providing structure was put by the floods into the floodplain. Next slide, please. Now the East Fork is different. In 2001, it lost the alders and streamside canopy and so on, but there was little channel change that first year or the second year. There were no silt in the pools, no filling, and that's because of the geology. If you look at the channels here, you've got these big sandstone boulders and smaller cobbles, and they provide structure in the stream, and the fine sediment just rinses right on through. In 2023, the flood was substantial in this system, but the pools survived, but the boulders that you see in the pools aren't the boulders that were there the previous year. Those are boulders that have been rinsed down by the flood. Right now, this is the best habitat on Waddell Creek. Next slide, please. Now, I got started with this study because we were trying to figure out what's going on with coho salmon and steelhead in Waddell Creek. And the coho salmon is an endangered species, and it spawns early in winter, so it's subject to getting rinsed out by floods and by sediment movement with those floods. It rears in the pools, and it's got a 3-year female life cycle. And so if you have a bad year, 3 years later, you won't have a good year because there was nothing produced in that 1 year in terms of females, and so you've got no new coho. In 2022, there are very few coho in the stream, about 2 per 100 feet. And in 2023, no coho. Now the steelhead are more resilient. They spawn later in winter and use a variety of habitats and are very, very flexible in their life history. But in both 2022 and 2023, there were very few steelhead, about 5 fish per 100 feet, as opposed to 50 fish per 100 feet in Scott Creek, immediately the watershed to the east. So the pools for coho rearing and overwintering fish are mostly filled, and it's going to take a while. Sediment input and movement destroyed the nest, and log jams probably block some of the fish movement. Next slide, please. Now, red-legged frogs down in the lower part of Waddell Creek is where they were most abundant because they breed in some ponds down by the lagoon. But we did studies. This is a red-legged frog with a transmitter on, so we could track them around at night and during the day. But red-legged frogs forage nightly on the vegetated banks of deep, woody pools. The vegetated banks are not there. The deep, woody pools are not there. They also use a lagoon, and that's the one place where they're still present on Waddell Creek. Next slide, please. So the real recovery concerns here are the continued sediment from upstream from the west slope of the west fork of Waddell Creek, which is steep and still has very little ground cover. And the channel wood, which is normally considered a benefit to the stream, is concentrated in a few log jams that are potential fish barriers, but there's little channel wood for pool structure. The alders and other canopy trees, the alders were basically eliminated, and the canopy of the redwoods was reduced by the burning of the branches. Now, similar damage came from floods in 82 and 83, but it was basically recovered within about 15 to 20 years. Now, flushing of the sediment from those same floods in 82 and 83 was improved again in 10 to 15 years, but that's if the inputs stop or are substantially reduced, and that doesn't appear likely for a while on the west fork of Waddell Creek. And then frequent years like 82, 83, 98, 217, and last winter aggravate the situation in terms of sediment and sediment movement in the system. So, and this winter is expected to be an El Nino winter, which often means heavy storms. Be time for questions.
Okay, thank you, Jerry. We have a few minutes for questions. The next talk will be in a few minutes. We had one question about where this is located relative to Davenport, and then maybe another question is how relatable is your work across different other watersheds, or how similar might it be in other watersheds within the CZU burn complex, like watersheds down by Davenport?
Okay. Waddell Creek enters north of Davenport about 10 miles. It's the Rancho del Oso section of Big Basin, which mostly is close to public access right now, other than immediately down near the beach. So the stream immediately north of Waddell Creek is Gazos Creek, which I actually did surveys on Gazos Creek, and the stream immediately south is Scott Creek, which enters about 5 miles north of Davenport. Those streams, the damage was less. There was substantial sedimentation that went into the stream in 2022 on both streams, but that winter the fish got a break because the storms were in October and December, and the fish come in basically in December and afterwards. And so they were able to spawn in those two streams without major storms coming after to destroy the nest. And the fish numbers were actually as high as they've ever been in those two streams in 2022. This last winter on Gazos Creek, the major storms knocked the fish numbers down so that instead of having 50 steelhead per 100 feet, we're down around 18 per 100 feet. Scott Creek has both coho and steelhead in moderate numbers this year. So Waddell is a stream of the three that got really hammered and is going to continue to get hammered.
Okay. And then, thank you. I think you answered Portia's question also, where Portia was asking what were these numbers, what do these numbers look like before the fire? The numbers of fish, the coho salmon, for example.
Scott Creek is the big coho producer south of San Francisco. There's a restoration hatchery on it, and they release smolts to come back 2 years later. And they stray to Waddell. Waddell has had some problems. It had good numbers of fish from 92 to 99, and then we started having some problems, apparently with toxic kills on the East Fork and the main stem in many years. Apparently, I've always assumed that there was meth lab waste going into the system. So Waddell more recently it has varied in terms of how abundant the fish have been, but the numbers that we got this year and last year are really low, even compared to some of the years when we had apparent fish kills.
All right. Well, thank you, Jerry. We need to move on now to the next speaker. We have Drew Peltier here from University of Nevada, Las Vegas. He is a redwood biologist working on the redwood sprouts and looking at carbon from the redwood sprouts and their ages. So, Drew, can you share your screen?
Yep, I will go ahead and do that.
Perfect.
Does that all look good?
Yes. All right.
Okay, and can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Wonderful. All right. Well, I'll just get going. I just want to say thanks, Zane and Steve and Jen and the Santa Cruz Mountains Bioregional Council for inviting me. This is a neat event. I'm excited to learn more about Big Basin tonight. As Zane said, I'm going to be talking about specifically how trees resprout following fire. Basically how these redwoods are recovering after this big fire event. So I'm sure you've seen lots of pictures of this fire, and some of you are maybe from the area. I just want to talk about my own personal experience with it. I'm from Arizona, and so we found out about it through the news, basically. And so by the time we actually went to do our science, it had already happened. And we showed up in about February of 2021. And you know, it was really just kind of a shocking experience. We were there to answer all these sort of neat, exciting science questions. And at least I was really kind of unprepared for the damage to the park that we saw, damage to infrastructure and the visitor center and things like that. But of course, the reason we were there was to study this really cool recovery. So redwoods are really unique among at least conifers in that they can resprout. That is, they can grow new leaves after fire events. And so we were there to kind of study this process. I'm just messing with my Zoom controls. And so one of the things that we did was to put up a phenocam. So we climbed one of these trees and put up a camera, which takes repeat images to kind of study how quickly and how much these trees were resprouting after that fire event. And what we saw was pretty remarkable. So in April 2021, when we set it up, you can see that all these trees are brown. They have no green foliage. And 2 years later, in 2022, they're all fully leafed out. And I actually just pulled the image from today, and I almost didn't recognize it. These trees are just so bushy now. And this is all to say that the phenocam is a publicly available resource. You can go to this URL here. It's the Santa Cruz 2 site, and you can actually look every day at the recovery of Big Basin from these fire events. So pretty cool. So to get at what I'm going to be talking about, the main analogy I really want you to understand tonight is this analogy of kind of the gas tank. So we were there to study how these trees store and use energy over really long time periods and how that stored energy can help to fuel this resprouting. So we call this non-structural carbon. It's basically stored sugars and starches, basically past photosynthesis, and this can support metabolism under stress. And so the analogy is it's like an energy reserve. It's like a gas tank, or in this case, it's our reserve of sugars. And so the thing about these reserves in trees is that, well, trees are pretty big and pretty old. And one thing you may know about redwoods is that they are really big and they're really old. And so we were curious, first of all, just how old the reserves were that were supporting this resprouting process. That is, how long these trees have been storing these carbon reserves before they used them to grow new leaves. And so to answer that question, we had to use what's called radiocarbon dating. And specifically, we wanted to use this really neat thing called the bomb spike. And so if you've not heard of the bomb spike, I like to put out this article in The Atlantic. It's a really nice summary called How Nuclear Testing Transforms Science. But the bomb spike is in one sense a catastrophe. It's nuclear bomb testing in the atmosphere in the 1950s and 60s. But in another, it's this worldwide label of basically the global carbon cycle throughout the biosphere. And so it's been used for all sorts of cool things. For example, figuring out how old Greenland shark, how long they live, 400 or 500 years. For our purposes, we want to use it to understand plants, obviously. And so this is that bomb spike. This is just the concentration of 14C of radiocarbon in the atmosphere on the y-axis. And on the horizontal axis here is just time. So you see this spike, which is a function of nuclear bomb testing. And following the bomb test treaty in 1963, we stopped doing that. And so radiocarbon has declined since then. And there's this really nice annual record. And so this is all relevant because photosynthesis is a sample of that carbon in the atmosphere. And so if we look at the amount of 14C in a little sprout, for example, and we compare that to this atmospheric record, we can come up with a really precise estimate of the age of the carbon that was used to build that sprout. And so I say age, but what I really mean is just time since photosynthesis happened. It's a measure of how long that carbon has been stored in that tree before it got used to build new leaves today, right? And so kind of our questions for this study were basically just how old is the carbon these trees are using to build these sprouts? And kind of secondarily, where is it coming from in these giant trees? And so what we did is right after the fire, we went out and found sites on these trees that were sprouting. And we covered them with this, you can see this little aluminum foil basically to exclude light. So that way we made sure no photosynthesis was happening and the trees were just relying on reserves to grow these new sprouts. We then measured the 14C in those sprouts and determined how old that carbon was. The other thing we did is we took sapwood cores, so increment tree cores of tree rings, to kind of look at where in the stem maybe this carbon is coming from, if it's coming from tree rings. And so what we found is pretty neat. Essentially, the oldest carbon that we measured dated to about the year 2000. Now, this was in 2021. So what that means is that one of these trees used carbon that was 21 years old to regrow new leaves. Now, this is definitely the oldest carbon that has been measured being used for metabolism. And it makes sense because redwoods are just really long-lived giant trees. But the thing to know about this is that kind of just like your gas tank, actually, NSC reserves are a mixture built up year after year. You never fully empty the tank and you're always adding new carbon, new energy, right? And so the distribution of that pool has a lot of different ages mixed in. And so 21 years is really just the average age of what is a mixed age pool at various different locations within these really big giant trees, in roots and in tree rings and up in the canopy. And so we wanted to do some simulation modeling to try and understand kind of the shape of that mixture, essentially. And so with some simple assumptions, basically, and kind of what I just described, that most of it is young and some is very old, what we found is that mixtures that from our simulations that really matched our observations suggested that 5 to 50% of the carbon reserves were older than 57 years. And so what that means is that carbon reserves that were fixed, that is photosynthesized from the atmosphere, sometime before 1963 are now being used 50, 60 years later to grow new tissue after this fire. So really remarkably old carbon reserves that have been stored for a really, really long time in these giant trees. The other thing I said we did is we took tree cores, right? So we measured the age of reserves actually in individual tree rings in these giant trees. And so on the y-axis here is just the radiocarbon concentration. And on the horizontal axis there is just the ring. So where we are in the stem, where 0 is the most recent ring. And as we go deeper into the tree, into older rings, you go to the right on this horizontal axis. And so what we found is that sapwood carbon reserves also were very old, possibly 56 to 100 years old. And this is a little in the weeds here, but usually we see this line go up as we go deeper into the tree, and we saw it go up and then go down, which really suggests the presence of so-called pre-bomb carbon. That is, carbon reserves that were fixed long before nuclear bomb testing ever happened. So long before 1963, 1950s. So very old carbon reserves, essentially, are being used to support this metabolism in these really old giant trees. A really, really cool observation for us. Kind of the last thing that we did is we were just curious kind of anatomically how this process worked. And so, we saw obviously all these sprouts coming out all over these trees. And one question we had is sort of how are these trees doing it, or where are these sprouts kind of coming from? Are they originating in the bark or somewhere else? And so we took some cross sections of some fallen segments, some fallen sections and fallen trees. And what we found were these little lines, basically. And so what you see is that under all of the sprouts that we examined were these bud traces. So these lines that go all the way from the outside, right under the sprout, to the center of the tree, to the pith, essentially. And so what these are they're called vascular bud traces. And so what they imply is that the bud tissue, so the meristematic tissue that these sprouts grew from, is actually very old as well. That is, it's as old as there are rings here. So in this bottom example, along the bottom, this really big cross section, this bud trace crosses 600 rings. That means the bud that built a sprout now in 2021 split off from a branch 600 years ago, and has just been moving along on the outside of this stem for 600 years, kind of waiting for something, I guess a big fire, to grow. And so we thought this was a pretty remarkable observation, and it suggests these trees are just really adapted to these fire events. So they're storing really old carbon, but they're also preserving this bud tissue for really long periods of time, so that they're ready to grow lots of new leaves after a damaging fire. So that's kind of the story I wanted to tell. So I have one slide here. I'll talk about some future work that we're doing. We just have recently started working in some giant sequoia, so the other giant tree species in California. We were up in the Mariposa Grove in Yosemite National Park. Some of these trees have experienced fire too over the past couple of years, as you may have read. And one thing that happens after fire in these trees is that some of them are attacked by bark beetles. So a question that we have is essentially, do these old carbon reserves also support resilience to fire and beetles? And are they perhaps just as old as in Redwood or older? All these questions are kind of open, and this is some stuff that we're exploring. And the other thing I'll just say is that we also have a phenocam in this grove also. It's called Sequoia 1, and there's the URL. And if you want to look at Sequoia every day and the weather, you're welcome to. It's online. It's a cool thing. There's lots of other sites there as well. So that's kind of my talk. If I can just summarize, what we found essentially is that after the fire, these redwoods used 50 to even possibly 100-year-old carbon reserves. That is carbon that was photosynthesized from the atmosphere up to 100 years ago, was used to rebuild new leaves after this extreme fire event. And we looked in the sapwood and tree rings, and the reserves that were stored there are perhaps even older. So in combination with these really ancient bud tissues that these trees seem to maintain, it suggests that coast redwoods are just supremely fire adapted, and were, in one sense, well prepared for this fire event, and they seem to be recovering, at least so far. So I'll stop sharing, or I'll try. I just see a pause button.
Oh,
oh, there it is. I figured it out.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you, Drew. That talk was really interesting. So I also work on these bud sprouts. We had a question, how common are these bud sprouts in other trees in the park? Like, are they in oaks? Are they in tan oaks? Are they in madrones? And do you think that they use the same sort of reserve system that goes back decades?
Yeah, so yeah, great question. So I heard tan oak. The tan oak resprouted, but only from the base, it seems like, as far as I have seen. Douglas fir does not resprout, and so those trees all died, all the ones that burned severely. Resprouting is pretty common in like eucalypts in Australia, has a lot of very fire-adapted tree species. but it's not so common in pines for whatever reason. And it's pretty common in the chaparral in coastal California too, these sort of shrubland ecosystems that experience regular fire. So essentially, it's something that you see in fire-adapted species. As to the availability of these old reserves, we know that reserves support growth in all plants, basically. I think coast redwoods are just a really exceptional example of a very long-lived and large tree species that is able to hold on to these reserves for a very long time.
Awesome. Yeah. And someone else asked about the myrtaceae specifically, which are those eucalypts. Yeah. Yep. So similar sprouting. Yep. Great. Thank you. Another question is, did you see any difference between bole sprouts, so sprouts on the trunk, versus basal sprouts? Were they basically using the same reserves of carbon, or do you think slightly different ages of the carbon?
Yeah, it would be really neat to do something like that. Unfortunately, when we showed up, it was really hard to tell which trees were going to fall over and which were going to stay up. So we weren't really able to climb any to kind of figure that out. And we were a little bit restricted to the bottom of trees, basically. We did sample along this one tree that fell across a river and resprouted all along the length of it. There was variability. It wasn't super systematic. I will say some of those sprouts at the base are getting completely huge now. I was there about a year ago, and one of the sprouts, which was 2 years old, I guess at the time, had a diameter about that big. I mean, it's basically a tree after 2 years. So they're growing really fast at the base, as I'm sure lots of people have seen if you've been out in the park.
Yeah. So another question along those lines about the base of these sprouts. So when a sprout grows, can it regrow into a branch that basically is the same structural strength as the branches that preceded it? Or does it lose something about strength, or lose something about vigor, or does it lose anything as it grows?
Yeah, so this is kind of the question going forward, right? Because we really want to know, when is it going to look like it did in the past? And to me, it's not super clear. Lots of trees drop branches, but some trees kept their branches. And for example, one of our study trees, it kept most of its branches. It resprouted along all those branches, but then a year later, all the branches fell off. So it's hard to say. It seems like it's really still changing a lot. One or two of our study trees has fallen over in these big storms last winter. But it seems like a lot of them are at least alive and coming back. Obviously, a lot of them look like these sort of green bottle brush trees. And to answer the question of how long until they look like this big full canopy redwood that we remember, I'm not sure, but it could be a while, right?
Good. Then another question we have is, basically, so depending on how many green sprouts there are on a tree, if a tree has, some of them have a lot of green sprouts everywhere, and then others don't have that many. And do you think that says anything about whether the tree is going to survive or make it? Like, can we say that green sprouting trees are going to live post fire? And
that's what I want to say. I want them to survive. It's hard to know. Certainly, there was a lot of heterogeneity, a lot of variability. In some trees were just completely covered; they turned totally green. Others resprouted in these sort of disparate patches across their stem. It's hard to know whether that was from fire damage. Maybe there are parts of the bark that got cooked on those trees, and the green ones were sort of had thicker bark and survived, or didn't burn as intensely there. Certainly the ones with more foliage seem to have a better carbon balance, looking at the sort of data that we've collected subsequently. And the ones that really are, maybe it's sort of the most uncertain, is the really old, really tall trees that lost their big branches, and now they're just restricted to that green pole. I'm not totally sure. I think a lot of it, honestly, I think depends on what happens next. Are we going to have a big drought year this year? We're going to have another big rain event. Those sorts of things, that sequence of events, I think is going to matter going forward for some of these trees.
Great. And then one final question, and then we'll move on. Let's see. The question was about if this work do you think it applies to the whole redwood range? Do we know with other redwood fires if any other data from different parts of the range would be helpful or correspond with your data that you got in Big Basin?
Yeah, I don't know. I would love to do this other places. I mean, the big basin redwoods are big, but they're not as big as the ones up in the Pacific Northwest, obviously. There's reason to think that maybe there may be older carbon kicking around in those huge trees up there. I have no idea. It would be great to study, although I would hope that those places don't burn and we don't get to do this study again. That would be better.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much. That was a very interesting talk. And I know a lot of us care about the redwoods, so it's nice to have a nice redwood talk here on the program.
Great, okay. Thanks. Excited to see who's next.
Yes. So we are moving on next to Jon Keeley. Jon, are you here with us?
I'm here. Can I share my screen?
Yes, please do. So Jon Keeley is a senior scientist at the USGS and a professor at UCLA. He did some work on Ceanothus, which is that green bushy plant, or one of the major green bushy plants at the base of the redwood trees in Big Basin, and knobcone pines. And so he'll tell us about those two species. And we would like to apologize. In some of our press releases, we misspelled Jon's name. His last name is Keeley, Jon Keeley. So thank you, Jon.
Yeah, that was a surprise because throughout my life, my first name is what has been misspelled.
Mm-hmm.
People seem to always want to put an H in there.
All right.
Let me see if I can bring up this talk. I thought I had it already here.
Okay.
Okay. Is it being shared, or what do I need to do at this point?
You'll need to press share screen down at the bottom of your Zoom window.
So how does that look?
Let's see. Looks great. We can see it perfectly.
Okay, great.
Thanks, Jon.
I really appreciate being invited to participate in this session. I particularly like Drew's talk. I have had experience in the past dealing with this bomb spike. We did a study many years ago dealing with plants in the Andes in South America, where we were trying to show that carbon was coming from the sediment, and it showed up very clearly in this bomb spike with the carbon isotope. So it related very well to what Drew described as a way to tell whether plants are using new or old carbon. But on to Big Basin. I first was in Big Basin many years ago. I went on a camping trip with my daughter, Katie, and I remember us eating blueberries around our campground. Katie is now head of GIS for the state of Michigan, so obviously it's been a long time since I've been in Big Basin. But I got interested in recently after the CZU fire because we have been doing a study trying to understand how different fire intervals impact recruitment of species in California ecosystems. And CZU has certainly seemed like a nice place to begin. As we've already discussed, one of the clear characteristics of the Big Basin redwoods is this ability to resprout epicormically along the base, and estimates I've seen is that over 90% of these trees often will resprout after a fire. And that in itself, it wasn't a focus of our study, but it was of interest to me because I'm stationed in Sequoia National Park, and we have a sequoia there, and it doesn't respond anywhere like the coast redwood. In fact, it's totally unlike coast redwood. We don't know the sites we studied the exact age because we didn't age any of the stems, but I was told that probably 1904 was the last fire in these stands. And what was particularly interesting was if you look in the understory of these redwood stands, they're just covered with this green layer of basically a monotypic layer of Ceanothus thriciflorus. And so this was of interest to describe what the density of Ceanothus thriciflorus was in these stands. This is just a description of the sort of data we collected. These were stands. This is an individual stand. We visited it 2 years after the CZU. Prior fire, we guess is 116 years based on what we've been told. The pre-fire density based on the skeletons of the trees on that site was 250. 100% of those trees resprouted. But we saw no seedlings, which was an important observation for us because we're concerned about what is the ratio of resprouts to seedlings. And here's a second site we studied, more higher density, but still close to 100% resprouting capacity, no seedling recruitment. Ceanothus, on the other hand, no resprouting at all. And it's largely because there were no plants prior to the fire. In other words, it would appear that the previous Ceanothus had died out, but massive numbers of seedlings, 50 to 100,000 seedlings per hectare of Ceanothus. So this was particularly interesting from our perspective, in part because it appears that this is a species that comes in after a fire, lives for some period of time, we don't know how long, but clearly not 116 years, produces copious amounts of seeds that go into the soil, and then after a fire, they recruit. And this phenomenon is known from a lot of different systems. We've seen it in other California ecosystems. Probably the classic example of this is in an Oregon forest of Douglas fir, which was known to have been 400 years of age at the time of the fire. And after that fire, massive numbers of Ceanothus vellutinus came in. So clearly, this is a strategy that some of the Ceanothus have developed where they live for a period of time, produce copious amounts of seeds, and then those seeds have phenomenal lifespan in the soil. And in this case, clearly at least 100 years, but in other cases, we appear at several hundred years. Now, one of the things that struck me of particular interest, because I'm stationed in Sequoia National Park, and we have a sequoia there, but it's a very different sequoia than what you have in Big Basin. You have Sequoia sempervirens. In Sequoia National Park, we have Sequoia dendron giganteum, very different species, and it's different in a lot of ways. Right after fire, Sequoia sempervirens resprouts, both from the base as well as from the stems. Sequoia dendron giganteum, absolutely no capacity for resprouting. We've never seen any indication that these plants will resprout after a fire. And if there's a crown fire, like we saw in the CZU in Big Basin, the Sequoia giganteum would be totally killed, and there would be no resprouting coming in after that fire. We think part of that reason is just a difference in the historical fire regime in these landscapes. This is the Central Coast distribution of lightning fires over the last 70 years. And this is the distribution in the Sierra Nevada. Sierra Nevada has much higher fire frequency from lightning. They have frequent fires, and these trees have basically evolved to deal with frequent fires. And we also see the same thing with the Ceanothus. Here's the Ceanothus thriciflorus after the fire in Big Basin. Lots and lots of seedling recruitment. In Sierra Nevada, after the KNP fire, we saw very few seedlings, but most of them were resprouts. And part of the reason we believe that is the difference is in these Big Basin populations, fires are relatively infrequent. The Ceanothus die out before another fire occurs. In the Sierra Nevada, we have a lot of lightning ignited fires, and so these shrubs are burned frequently, and they have adapted to resprouting after the fires. Now, the other part of our work in Big Basin has been to look at chaparral and how they regenerate. There are a lot of species of chaparrals that will resprout. This is Arctostaphylos crustacea that here you can see lots of resprouts coming up after the fire. They do just fine by resprouting after these fires. But then there are other species like Arctostaphylos andersonii, which doesn't resprout at all. But these are seedlings that have been recruited in the understory of those burned out Arctostaphylos andersonii. So two very different strategies for recovering from fire. And just to illustrate this, we have a couple of these species that have no ability to resprout. This is Andersonii and sensitiva from Big Basin. Post-fire resprouting percentages, none of them resprout, but they produce copious numbers of seedlings, but it's largely a function of stand age to some extent. And just to relate this to the ability of these species to recover to their pre-fire population size, this is seedlings per pre-fire shrub. And here in this site, 780. In other words, there was more than enough Andersonii seedlings to replace the pre-fire population. This stand here, probably enough to replace the stand, although not nearly as impressive as the previous stand. And these are a couple sensitiva stands, anywhere between 7 to 20 individuals, or 7 to 20 seedlings per pre-fire individual. So it appears that these chaparral shrubs are recovering just fine after the CZU fire. Now, one of the last things I'll just point out is we were very interested in the knobcone pine populations, which occur upslope from most of the sequoia or redwood populations. And knobcone pine is what we call a serotinous pine. In other words, it produces lots of cones, and you can see the remnants of these cones on burned out stems that don't open until fire. And then fire heats those cones and releases the seeds. And so they generally reproduce by producing a single cohort after the fire. And we've aged these stems here, and they produce very clear annual rings. So we have a pretty good idea of what the age of these stands were prior to the CZU fire. And this is an illustration of the patterns we saw with 3 different stands of knobcone pine. Here's stands 47, 60 years of age, and obviously no resprouting occurs in these pines, but they produce copious numbers of seedlings, and we get a good number of seedlings per pre-fire tree, 10 to 20 seedlings per pre-fire tree, clearly indicating they have the potential for replacing the original population when they're 47 to 60 years of age. But here's a site that we also studied at Big Basin, 26 years since the last fire, and the number of seedlings per pre-fire tree was 0.13. In other words, there were 10 times more pre-fire trees than there were seedlings, suggesting they potentially are threatened by being replaced after the CZU fire, simply because the stand wasn't old enough at the time of the CZU fire to produce a large enough seed bank to carry or to produce seeds. And this is an illustration of what one of these younger stands look like. You can see there's almost no cones on those trees. And as a result, when the CZU came through, this 26-year-old stand just wasn't old enough to have enough seeds to replace itself. And so that's a potential threat that needs to be looked at in terms of fires in Big Basin. And one of the important things to understand is what caused this low short interval between fires. This is an illustration of Big Basin. This is the China Grade Road here, and this site was right about here. And the red outlines indicate past prescription burns in the Big Basin area. In other words, this stand was burned basically about 16 years prior to, or 26 years prior to the CZU fire, and it simply didn't have enough cone production to regenerate after the fire. And it suggests that we have to be perhaps prudent about using prescription burning in these sites, because anytime you put a prescription burn on the landscape, you basically have to ensure that that landscape's going to escape fire for at least 3 decades if it's going to recover. And if it doesn't, then you're likely to extirpate that species from the site. And that's what we've seen following this 1994 prescription burn along the China Grade Road is that we did a burn in 1994, probably with the greatest intentions. There was no problem at the time, but we have to realize that when you put fire on the ground, you're essentially threatening the persistence of certain species like knobcone pine if there's another fire within the next several decades. So I'll just end it there. I want to thank Big Basin for permission to work in the park, and Joanne Kurbovitz was a big help in terms of finding sites, and I appreciate her assistance, and happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you, Jon. So I thought this was really interesting. I hadn't heard, or I hadn't thought about how plants could have evolved specific fire frequency intervals that they want to use, you know? So like knobcone pine can't deal with the frequency of fire quite like a sprouting shrub might. One question I had is, how does dispersal play a role? So like, what do the seeds of some of these plants look like, and how easily can they get around, right?
Well, there's very little likelihood that knobcone pine seeds travel very far. We have done some studies looking at seed dispersal in pines, and some pines that have smaller seeds and large wings can travel fairly far. But knobcone pine is not adapted to dispersing spatially. It's adapted to dispersing temporally. So it's dependent on sitting on a site and developing a seed bank, and then when a fire comes through, they drop their seeds on that site. So there's probably very little likelihood that these sites where Ceanothus, or excuse me, Arctocephalus have been extirpated, that they're going to come back in. In other words, you probably lost that knobcone pine stand.
Okay, and we have a question from Michael Loic, who asked on YouTube, so the 26-year-old knobcone pine population was also denser. And so the question's asking, could it have something to do with, could the density have something to do with recruitment, or is it based on seed bank alone, you think?
Well, I think that's a general pattern with all of these stands. They start out with high density, and over time they thin. And so I don't know that the higher density in younger stands is necessarily anomalous. It's to be expected that if you produce a single cohort of seedlings after a fire, they're going to grow up, and over time they'll thin out and the density may decline. But we've done these sorts of studies in lots of sites throughout the state. We've been studying over 60 fires in the last 3 years, looking at fire interval for these stand replacing type species. In other words, species that we have to recruit after a fire. And it's very clear the time between fires is highly critical to whether or not species recruit. It's particularly true in many of the chaparral species that have to recruit from seedlings. There are a lot of chaparral species that resprout, and they're not threatened by short intervals. But 60% of our shrubs in chaparral are obligate seeders. They have to come back from seeds, and they have to accumulate a seed bank. And we've found that throughout the state, fires at less than 20-year intervals are a threat to Ceanothus obligate seeders, and at intervals less than 30 years, they're potentially a threat for Arctocephalus. So this is an issue that needs to be given a lot more consideration, particularly because right now the state is putting a huge amount of money into prescription burning and other sorts of treatments. And there's a lot of experience behind the people who are doing this work, but most of that experience comes from conifer forests. And in the conifer forests, you can burn as frequent as you want and probably not cause resource damage. In chaparral, it's absolutely not the case. If you burn at too high an interval in chaparral, you can extirpate species, and it's primarily the obligate cedars, and they comprise about 60% of the diversity of shrubs in our chaparral system. So it's a huge issue if you're concerned about resource issues. The problem is CAL FIRE is the primary agency dealing with fire hazard reduction, and resource protection is not a big part of their mandate.
Yes. Okay. And then one other question that I guess it brings it more practical to someone who is on the trail crew or asking about the trail crews. When you see knobcone pine seedlings in the park, would you recommend we leave them or try to like sort of stay away from them and let them grow? Yeah, that's the question.
Well, why wouldn't you?
I suppose so.
If you're going through a big basin and you see seedlings of any pine, what would you have the inclination to get rid of them?
But you're having to build the trail itself, so like
I see.
Special attention paid.
I see. Well, if it's in the middle of a trail, I would say that might have priority.
Okay. Thank you. And then I guess there was one other question, and then we have to move on. So just to make it real brief, do you think, and this might not be known, but do you think Ceanothus growth creates water competition with the redwoods and knobcones? Like a lot of Ceanothus on the ground makes it much harder for redwoods or pines or anything else to come up?
I think there's very definitely the potential. We don't have good data on that, but I see no reason not to think that it's a potential problem that people ought to be consider. The one issue I didn't mention during this discussion of this colonization of Ceanothus trissiflorus is it came in this 116-year, or we assume it was a 116-year-old stand, entirely from a seed bank, presumably because it was so old the shrubs died before that fire occurred. One thing we have never been able to pin down is in younger stands, does that species, Ceanothus trissiflorus, resprout if it's burned at a younger age? And so anybody in the audience who has information on that, I would definitely like to hear from them.
All right. Thank you, John. We have to move on to our next speaker, Alex Rinkert. Alex, are you here with us?
I'm here.
All right. So Alex Rinkert is a biologist working on birds. His study is going to be on the breeding birds in Big Basin, or his talk is going to be on the breeding birds of Big Basin. And you should be able to share your screen.
All right, is that coming through?
Yes, perfect.
Great.
Thank you.
So thanks for having me at the symposium. Tonight, I'm going to share some results from a project that I began 3 years ago now, looking at breeding birds in the Santa Cruz Mountains and how they were impacted by the CZU fire. So despite having numerous large fires in recent decades, there's little known about how birds have responded to fire in the Santa Cruz Mountains. There are a few local studies of how grassland birds have responded and anecdotal observations over the years of the so-called fire-following species that appear after burns, such as this black-chinned sparrow. but there isn't anything quantitative on how forest species respond to fire in the Santa Cruz Mountains. Then came the CZU fire, possibly the largest on record in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And one of the things that was unique about this fire is that it burned large tracts of old growth at an extreme severity. So studying the effects of this fire would help us understand how birds in old growth and also other habitats respond to fire, exacerbated by decades of fire suppression and climate change. And that's what I set out to do with this study. The study area was the CZU burn and areas immediately adjacent to it. In 2021, I established 206 point count stations. About half of those were in the burn and the other half were in unburned areas nearby. And several factors determined where those stations were placed. The burn severity at each station was evaluated on the ground using Steve Singer's modified composite burn index. And most stations were placed in areas that burned at high to extreme severity, which left little to no canopy cover or even understory in some places. I sampled 4 habitats that were common within the CZU burn. Old growth redwood forest with 66 stations, second growth redwood forest, mixed evergreen forest, and Chalk's chaparral. So most of these stations were visited once each year between 2021 and 2023. And at each station, I conducted a 5-minute point count, recording all the birds that I could see and hear from that location. And the preliminary results that I'm sharing tonight are focusing only on old growth and second growth redwood forest and stations that burned at high to extreme severity. And only species that were frequently detected on surveys were included in analyses. So out of about 70 total species that I detected on surveys, only 30 to 40 or so were included in these results. Earlier, I briefly mentioned that there was some pre-fire data at some of these stations. This pre-fire data was collected during the Forest Bird Monitoring Program between 2002 and 2004 by David Sudgen using a very similar methodology that I used. And about half of the stations that I surveyed at the past few years were also surveyed during the Forest Bird Monitoring Program. So that data is included in these results as a pre-fire reference. So given the high and extreme severity of the burn, the forest structure in many places was completely altered. And this hinted at a parallel restructuring of the avian community that would result. So I looked at 3 metrics that can be used to describe the avian community to see if any of those changes had occurred. The first metric is the total number of birds. In this figure, the y-axis is the total birds. The x-axis shows each year following the burn, as well as pre-fire data from the early 2000s. In the first year after the fire, there were significantly fewer birds in the burn. However, in the second year, there was no difference between burned and unburned areas. And then in the third year, there were actually more birds in the burn than unburned areas. And there's a very similar pattern with total species and also diversity. So some conclusions that can be drawn from this are that the structure of the avian community changed in the first year following the fire, but by the second year had returned to something comparable to before the fire. And then in the third year, there's this shift to a more diverse and speciose community than what exists now in unburned areas. So now let's take a look at how individual species have changed. There were some immediate changes after the fire in 2021. There was the figure on the right is comparing abundance of species in burned and unburned areas, with the difference in the far right-hand panel showing the difference between burn and control. So the species that increased will have a dot on the right side of the orange line, and those that decreased will have a dot on the left side. And the species where the difference was significant are highlighted in bold. Some of the species that increased are known to respond positively to fire. Those include glass-eyed bunting, hairy woodpecker, and dark-eyed junco. One surprise was that purple finches were more abundant in the burn, as they're mainly found in more heavily forested areas with high canopy cover. And as far as I can tell, they're not really known to respond positively to wildfire. Some of the species that immediately declined included quite a few common residents, such as spotted towhee, chestnut-backed chickadee, and Pacific wren, as well as species associated with high canopy cover, such as Steller's jay and hermit thrush. So how did birds respond in the second year? This figure compares abundance of birds in the burn between 2021 and 2022. So in the second year, some of the most common residents, such as chestnut-backed chickadee and brown creeper, increased. And there was also a noticeable increase in ground nesting species, such as orange crown warbler, Pacific wren, and Wilson's warbler. And a few species also decreased in the burn in the second year, after being some of the most abundant species in 2021. Glass-eyed buntings and hairy woodpeckers became much scarcer. And it was also interesting to see acorn woodpeckers and band-tailed pigeons both decline. Acorns are a main part of both their diets, so there may have been something happening with the acorn crop that caused them to vacate the burn in the second year. And that brings us to this past summer, and this sort of shows where the recovery stands at this point. Both ground nesters and fire-following species are still at elevated abundances, and there are now some resident species that appear to have recovered, such as spotted towhee, American robin, and Pacific wren. However, there are some common species that are still much less abundant in the burn than in unburned areas. These include Pacific slope flycatcher and chestnut-backed chickadee. It's also apparent that species associated with higher canopy cover are also not recovering as well, such as hermit thrush, Steller's jay, and black-throated gray warbler. Some of the main takeaways I want to leave you with are that there were fewer birds immediately after the fire, but the avian community and many species are actually quickly recovering. However, some of the most common birds, like the Pacific slope flycatcher and chestnutback chickadee, still appear to be nowhere near a full recovery. And there are also some species that I didn't mention, such as the marbled murrelet and a few land birds that are closely tied to Douglas firs that we've nearly lost since the fire and whose recovery may take decades or even longer. So some future directions with this work is first and foremost to do a more complete analysis with this existing data, looking more at species responses and how guilds of species respond. And secondly, begin to survey for nocturnal species, which the surveys this past 3 years didn't capture, to see how they've responded to the fire. And finally, I'd like to thank the following groups who've supported my work the past few years, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Alex. I had a question. So would you call, and maybe this is really hard to decide, but would you call the increase of species diversity post-fire, like this 3rd year after the fire, compared to the control, would you call that a good thing? And if so, if it is a good thing, is there a way that we could somehow introduce fire to get that type of diversity that is done responsibly? If it's a bad thing, why is more species diversity a bad thing?
I don't know if I'd call it either a good or a bad thing. I think that it's the result of this unique habitat that now exists, where we have these giant old growth redwoods with no canopy and also chaparral underneath it. So we have 2 different communities in the same space now. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that with these prescribed burns that are being introduced in areas would create that kind of habitat. So I think these prescribed burns would keep the habitat much more intact and functioning like an old growth forest than what the CZU fire resulted in.
Okay, thank you. Another question that we had was, are conifer seed-eating birds doing well? And I guess what would those species be?
Some of the species that I mentioned, like dark-eyed juncos, do eat a lot of grains. And that's one of the things that I want to look into in these future analyses, is looking at the diet guilds to see how granivores, insectivores, and so on have responded to the fire. I think that would be really interesting. But I can say that at least some birds that do eat conifer seeds have increased after the fire, although I'm not sure if their diet is the reason why they've increased.
Okay, thank you. Another question from Drew, one of the earlier presenters, is he was curious about the decline of acorn-dependent species after the fire. And so in Redwoods, they've seen large acorn caches way up there. And do you think it's due to the acorns getting burned and the caches being lost, or something else?
Yeah, that's a really good idea. I'm not really sure why those 2 species, the acorn woodpecker and band-tailed pigeon, declined in the 2nd year and not the 1st year after the fire. I don't think the oaks are producing mast, or were producing mast in those first 2 years. So I'm not really sure what's going on, but it's interesting to see those 2 species respond similarly.
We had a question, did any new birds come to the park?
There are some birds that are now breeding there that weren't previously, such as song sparrow and a number of other birds that are usually found in places with denser undergrowth or less canopy cover have moved into these once heavily forested areas. But within the CZU area, there hasn't really been any new species showing up that weren't there in some abundance previously. I'm still waiting to come across a black-chinned sparrow or a bell sparrow, which are both species that are sometimes associated with fire. There's so much habitat for them out there that I think that there would be some at some point in the next few years. So I'll keep looking for those.
Okay. And then I guess the one other question is, do you think anything was extirpated or fully, like they're not even around at really low abundances that you didn't observe? Do you think there's any birds that may have been completely removed?
These low and moderately burned areas sort of served as refugia for some of the species that were almost extirpated, such as the golden-crowned kinglet, hermit warbler, marbled murrelet, which all are pretty closely tied to Doug firs and higher canopy covers. So I don't think that any species is completely gone, but some of them are in their last holdouts.
Okay, good. Well, thank you so much, Alex. We have to move on to the next speaker. If you have any more questions, they might be in the chats. So we'll move on now to Will Fort. Will Fort is the senior planner for California State Parks. And he's going to be talking about reimagining Big Basin. Again, thinking about what's the future of the park, future of infrastructure in the park, and how do we move forward. So Will Fort, yep, I see you're sharing your screen. Can you unmute yourself, Will?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, you can see my screen. This is working. Okay.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Zane. Thanks for having me and inviting me to be here today. It's been great to hear about all the research going on. I'm going to give an update that's a little different, not about research, but about planning and rebuilding park facilities at Big Basin and park access. And thanks for that introduction. My name is Will Fort. I'm senior planner working with state parks here at the Santa Cruz District. And I'm focused on plans for Big Basin after the CZU fire. So I'm going to talk about four main things today. I'm going to give some background on Big Basin as a park, talk about the CZU fire and the effects on the park infrastructure. Third, I'll talk about the reimagining Big Basin vision for the future of the park. And then lastly, I'll talk about park planning, next steps, and where we are currently. So to start, I'll take a step back, talk about some background. I wanted to share this map to remind us that Big Basin is a large park, 18,000 acres in the heart of the Santa Cruz Mountains, with over 4,000 acres of old growth redwood forest. That's why the park exists. And also, it is in the San Francisco Bay Area and Monterey Bay areas. So there are large population centers that are in close proximity to this park. And even though it is remote, it is very well loved and very visited by those urban populations, as well as from folks coming from far away. So it is a very important place for many people throughout many parts of California's history. And Big Basin is also the oldest state park in California. And it's really known mostly for its camping experiences, a lot of camping memories at this park, as well as the trails. There are over 80 miles of trails in Big Basin, including the West Waddell Creek State Wilderness Area, Berry Creek Falls, the Skyline to the Sea Trail, Semper Virens Falls, etc. Before talking about the future, I wanted to take a step back and look at the at the history a little bit of the park as well. In its most developed time, which was in the 1930s and 40s, there was a substantial amount of development in the recreational infrastructure in the heart of the old growth at Big Basin, right in the governor's camp. And so even at that time, there was the Big Basin Inn, or later the Lodge, and there was a dance floor, several cabins, and this pergola. There was even a swimming pool and tennis court and things like that. At that time, it was recognized that this amount of use was too much. It was thought that if it continued, that this area would be loved to death. And so some of this has been removed over the years. It's been scaled back. The amount of structures and all of these recreational amenities has been scaled back over the years. However, until the CZU fire, there were several of these historic structures were remaining in the park and were used to operate the park and for recreational access. And that all, of course, really changed with the CZU fire in August of 2020. And so here's one of those buildings, the historic administration building built by the Citizens Conservation Corps in the 1930s, and a few days after the fire, while it's still burning in the auto tree there. So everything was lost in that fire. And this fire progression map shows the outline of Big Basin, and each color is showing a 24-hour spread of the fire. And what this is showing is, as we all know and have been talking about today, the whole park burned in that 24-hour period. So it was a very intense fire. It burned with very high severity through a lot of the park. This is a severity map. There was a lot, as folks have been talking about today, a lot of loss of canopy of redwood forest, a lot of mortality of non-redwood trees, and some mortality of smaller redwood trees as well. And we know with climate change that we expect to see longer, more intense dry periods, hotter, drier periods in the future, and the chances of having a fire with dry field conditions and severe weather in the future is going to increase. Essentially, every piece of built infrastructure in the park was lost in the fire, including all the bridges, all the retaining walls, steps, culverts on 120 miles of roads and trails, over 100 buildings, counting all of the tent cabins, all of the restrooms for the camping areas, all of the park residents, all of the administration buildings, all the operational facilities, all the utility systems were lost. This is the museum store building area. You can see some of the old growth trees that were lost next to this structure fire here. You can also see the level of cleanup that was required throughout the park prior to restoring any public access. And this is the same site 2 years later, after the cleanup has been done and hazardous materials have been removed. And this site in this last year, or actually this photo is from this summer, has now been restored for public access with some temporary facilities. So in July of 2022, a small part of the park has reopened for public access with temporary facilities like these. There's still no water or utilities. There's a day use reservation system for a limited number of parking spaces in the park. We also had bus service to the park this summer with Santa Cruz Metro. The access that is restored is based on these interim facilities that allow a small amount of use, and it will take several years to rebuild facilities needed to restore the full access to the park, including the campgrounds, full parking, and operations, visitor center, and staff housing, and things like that. So now I'll talk a little bit about future plans, and I'll focus some on the Reimagining Big Basin project. After the fire, state parks initiated this Reimagining Big Basin Vision project to look at the long-term goals and plans for rebuilding the park. And with a loss of all the facilities, while that is tragic, we also have an opportunity to rebuild with the goals of keeping the health of the forest as really the highest priority and striving to increase equity and access to this park. And when rebuilding the park, the vision includes rebuilding some things differently than they were in the past. And doing this while honoring the history of the park and while striving to create the future trail and camping experiences in the park that are similar to what was most important to visitors in the past. And that is getting out into nature and experiencing the redwoods. And so this vision is going to guide all future planning efforts for the park. And it was developed through a focused public process, including some webinars, online community meetings, online survey. And the four most broad themes of this vision are shown on this slide, which are including resilient natural landscapes that allow ecological processes to occur, providing diverse experiences for our future diverse communities in California, increasing equity and access and providing meaningful experiences, and lastly, aesthetically designing facilities for sustainability and resilience while including a reverence to the park's history. And there's a set of 8 guiding principles as well, which describe the core values that will be referenced in future planning efforts, which I won't go through. This map highlights the vision's regional strategies, which are first restoring the pre-fire trail network in the park, and eventually pursuing additional trail access and opportunities in the backcountry areas. And second, being a leader in regional forest stewardship, including restoring connectivity of forested lands and actively managing post-fire recovery of forested areas primarily through prescribed fire and managing for future forest resiliency. And the area that's labeled here as Park Core is the focus for rebuilding facilities. So that'll be what's shown on this next map here. And this, I think, is the heart of the vision summary, which shows how facilities are envisioned to be replanned in the park. And what's shown here as number 1 is the historic headquarters of the main day use area at Big Basin, or where the governor's camp is, in the main old growth grove. The vision for this area is to have fewer structures and less paved area, some parking, but less than in the past, and to provide a more natural experience for visitors, but really to focus on the health of the old growth forest and allow forest stewardship projects and natural processes to occur in this area. What's shown as number 2 is the upper Sky Meadow, lower Sky Meadow, Huckleberry area. And the vision for this area is to have the bulk of the overnight use and camping experiences in the Redwoods, but outside the heart of the old growth where some of the campgrounds were located in the past. What's shown as number 3 is the vision for a Big Basin shuttle system. And shuttles at Big Basin are a strategy to bring visitors to the old growth area without the need for so much paving, so much parking in the old growth. So there are 2 primary shuttle systems that are going to be pursued at Big Basin. One is from the Saddle Mountain Welcome Area, which I'll talk about in a second, and the other is from further outside the park, which can be done in partnership with our local transit operator, which is Santa Cruz Metro, and that can bring visitors from farther outside the park from locations such as the Scotts Valley Metro Center. What's shown as number 5 is the Saddle Mountain Welcome Area, and this is an important site as part of the reimagining vision, where we can have a welcome area for visitors arriving to the park, where there can be information, there can be some staff operations, and there can be some visitor parking in this area as well. So at busy times, there can be a shuttle system that will bring folks from this area to the old growth core. And what's shown as number 6 is Little Basin. The vision is to restore group recreation and camping opportunities at Little Basin, and to pursue creating ceremonial and cultural space in partnership with local indigenous groups as well. So what I just covered is the vision summary, and moving forward, the large work ahead of us of planning to rebuild and manage the park will be completed in phases and stages. And so the next stage of rebuilding for visitor access and recreational facilities is currently underway. It's called the Facilities Management Plan. And that's the more formal planning document that will have site plans for each of these areas for each of the facilities. This is expected to be completed in 2025. And then after that, facilities can be designed so that they can be built. Separate from that, or not, on its own process on the next line is the trail network. Trails are currently being rebuilt in the park simultaneously with the planning phases that are happening. So reconstructing the trail network and restoring full access is expected to take many years. And after completing the facilities plan, there will be future opportunities to do a roads and trails management plan to look at additions or additional access to that trail network. But there's a significant amount of rebuilding to do on the existing trail network that was at the park before the fire. And additional segments of trail will become accessible to the public as they're made safe and accessible. And the last line on here is the forest stewardship projects. Forest management projects are being planned through a separate process, which is the preparation of a forest management strategy. And the forest management strategy is a project that's been underway for about 2 years now. It's extensive field data collection that has been occurring for this project with a team of foresters, and it's identifying the current post-fire forest condition and management recommendations, primarily through the use of prescribed fire to continue to manage forest areas for future resilience. And so I'll talk more about the facilities management plan. This is our large planning project that we're working on now, and this project kicked off this year. It will cover the core areas of the park only, so including Saddle Mountain, the main day use area, the Sky Meadow overnight areas, and Little Basin. And it will include site plans for rebuilding facilities for recreational access in these areas, including structures, campgrounds, day use, operational facilities, park utilities, and road and shuttle access. It's not going to cover trail planning or backcountry areas, trail camps, forest management. It's not going to cover Rancho del Oso or Waddell Beach. Those are all being planned, will be able to be planned in future phases or simultaneously through other processes, as I just described. And a little more about the facilities management plan process. We are currently wrapping up the first of 3 stages, which is called the basis of design. And this includes some engagement, including an online engagement with the community and with the public, which includes an online survey, which just closed about a month ago, several focus group meetings that have been done this fall, participation by community-based organizations who are bringing folks to the park who include first-time park visitors and underrepresented community members who are visiting the park and getting involved in the planning process. That's been occurring this summer as well. And there will be some future public open houses and meetings as part of this process. The next stage will be starting next year, and we will be developing design concepts for each of these areas. We will share design concepts with the public next year. And in 2025, we will be putting together a final preferred alternative for the facilities plan, including a full facilities management plan and a CEQA document, environmental review document that is associated with that. So that is our process. What I've just described is how we're planning permanent facilities to restore full park access. But during this planning phase, access will continue. There is access at the park now. It will continue to increase as areas are made safe and accessible. And currently there's an online reservation system, which is the only way to have guaranteed day use parking access. Make a reservation through the Friends of State Parks website. There are about 4 miles of trails open to hiking, including a section of Sunset Trail and Creeping Forest Trail that opened this year. There are about 18 miles of fire roads, which are open to hiking and biking, and there will be additional sections of trail that will open in future years as well. On the coast side, the Rancho del Oso Horse Camp is now temporarily open as a walk-in campground. That opened this summer. While there are no trails in the area, it's open for non-equestrian camping. And you can make reservations for that on the Friends of Santa Cruz State Parks website as well. There's also one bike-in site there for folks who are biking the Pacific Coast, and that site's first come, first serve, and it's shared. The Welcome Center at Rancho del Oso also just opened this fall with help from Save the Redwoods League, who have completely helped renovate that Welcome Center with interpretive information. And so along with that, I wanted to acknowledge support from several other partners, including Parks California, and including Semper Virens Fund, Save the Redwoods League, I just mentioned, Friends of Santa Cruz State Parks, the Mountain Parks Foundation, Latino Outdoors, and many, many other organizations who are helping. And with that, that's all I was going to share today. I hope that gives a general overview of the planning process post-CZU fire. If you want more information or you want to stay updated, visit reimaginingBigBasin.org. Sign up for the email list there, and you'll get updates about once a quarter and learn about opportunities to participate. So thank you.
All right. Thank you, Will. We have one question from someone asking specifics about campground spaces, and if there are going to be more campground spaces or fewer as there were before the fire with the movement of the campgrounds into Sky Meadow and to Little Basin.
Yeah, the exact number of campgrounds won't be determined yet, but the general goal is to create the types of experiences that we had and the types of visitation and level of visitation that we had before the fire. So the goal is to create a similar amount of campsites.
All right, thanks. Jon Keeley has his hand raised. Jon, you should be able to unmute yourself if you have a question here. And if not,
Okay, I guess I figured it out. Well, first off, let me just say, I think, Will, you did a great job explaining what needs to come forward in the future for the park. And what I note is the future of the park is largely focused on tourist issues. In other words, how can we change the park structure to avoid problems like we saw with the CZU. What I thought was interesting was I've just gone through the KZB fire here in Sequoia National Park. And in the workshop there, when they looked at the future, they talked a lot more about resource issues and what we need in terms of future resource issues. And it seems to me you avoided that issue. And I think that's a very good thing to do, because by and large, the resource issues are very different in Redwoods versus Sequoia National Park. You did put in a little note about how we need to do prescription burning, whereas in Sequoia National Park, there would be lots and lots of discussion of prescription burning. But I do think that it's important to realize that when you look at the ecological impact of the CZU fire on the redwood forest, there was relatively minimal impact. This is an ecosystem adapted to high intensity fires, and 90% or more of the trees resprouted. So clearly it's adapted to this system. And it's really questionable whether doing prescription burning would do you any good at all. And so for that reason, I'm really glad you didn't emphasize the need for doing that. Unlike someplace like Sequoia National Park, where we really do need to do prescription burning. So I would just say, I'm glad that you focused on the tourist issues and the infrastructure issues and didn't emphasize the need to do prescription burning when clearly these forests survive just fine.
Thanks for that comment. I appreciate that. I'm focused on the park rebuilding and facilities, but the resource issues at the park are paramount. They're forefront of the planning process and allowing ecological processes to occur, and having the most sensitive areas of the park, including the old growth, be less developed is a primary goal. Also, the use of prescribed fire is a major goal for the future of the park as well. So I'm not sure. I just wanted to clarify that. State Parks has been doing prescribed fire for many decades, as you know, at Big Basin, and as part of that forest management strategy, we'll be continuing to do prescribed fire as a way to maintain lower fuel loads and create a resilient forest structure. So that is a part of the future of the park as well.
Well, I haven't heard any justification for that perspective. I don't, just because there are a lot of forests in California that need prescription burning, Sequoia National Park is one of them. I see no reason to be doing that in Big Basin. You went over 100 years without a fire and 90% of the trees survived just fine. So how can you resource people justify doing prescription burning in Redwoods? I don't see the justification for doing it, other than this is what we learned from everybody else. But the bottom line is these ecosystems are very different. The coast ecosystems are very different than the interior ecosystems. And prescription burning, I see no value to it, because the Redwoods Big Basin Park, The trees survive just fine without prescription burning. But that's not the case in Sequoia National Park. We had 20% of the giant sequoias were lost in the KNP fire, and largely because we hadn't been doing prescription burning. And that's because those ecosystems are adapted to frequent understory burning. The coast redwoods are not. The coast redwoods are adapted to long interval fires with high intensity burning, and the response of your redwoods recently illustrates that you don't need to do prescription burning. And so to continue repeating this mantra, we should do prescription burning, seems to be disingenuous. I don't see any value unless somebody in redwoods can explain why you need to do it other than to protect structures.
So this is a discussion that we probably should have in a different form. There have been talks in the first symposium that are available on YouTube to watch that have looked at the prescribed burn areas of Big Basin and the non-prescribed burn areas of Big Basin. So that's one aspect. Another aspect that is not brought up a lot is a lot of the Douglas fir did die, like almost all of them in the park died. So redwoods might be fine, but there are other tree species in Big Basin that we should be concerned about, like the Douglas fir. But for right now, this discussion could go on for a long time, and I think we need to allow for other people to have their say in questions here. So thank you, Jon. We have some other questions. One of them is asking about the restoration of Skyline to the Sea Trail and if it's going to happen after 2027 or way, way, way out into the future.
There's not a specific timeline for restoring Skyline to the Sea Trail. There's 1 mile of Skyline to the Sea Trail that's open now from the main day use area north up to where Meteor Trail ties in. And I'm guessing that the question is mainly about the portion out to Berry Creek Falls, and yes, it's a significant amount of work that is ahead of us to restore the trail access in that area. So it is several years out.
Okay, thank you. And then another question about the planning are you envisioning increased uses of the roads within the park, like Lodge Road, China Grade Road, etc.? And if they need repairs, where is that funding coming from the county or somewhere else?
Yeah, access to the park on those road systems will be largely the same. There may be with camping and other things on Sky Meadow and Lodge Roads. The access from Sky Meadow Road, which connects to Lodge Road, would be a little different. Lodge Road and County Road, or sorry, Lodge Road and Little Basin Road are county roads. So funding for repairing and improving those would be through the county. Highway 236 is also obviously a state highway, so that one would be through Caltrans. China Grade is also a county road, and Sky Meadow Road. There are some park roads as well, so those would be part of the park system.
Well, thank you, Will. With respect for everyone's time, we're a little bit over, so we're gonna end it here. So thank you all for coming. We thank you for your dedication, for learning about Big Basin, learning about the ecosystems here. Obviously, there's a lot to still discuss and debate. It's still an open forum, and we need to have these discussions, and the park has put forward places where we can do that. So thank you for everyone for attending. Thank you to our speakers. We couldn't have done this without you. We really, really appreciate your time and your expertise at this symposium. And with that, I'll mention that this recording will be up on YouTube, so you can see it from here on. And there's the recording of last year's symposium where we had 7 different speakers talking about other aspects of the Big Basin fire recovery. So thank you all for your time and your attention, and have a good rest of your evening.